Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Kasey Smith, and today I will be telling you a little bit about competence to exercise the right to remain silent. I'm gonna be drawing on, of course, the book for the class, Melton's Psychological Evaluations for the Courts. So, just an outline of what we're going to be talking about. I have an opening scenario for us just to set the stage a little bit. Legal foundations, psychological components, populations at risk, assessment practices, legal and clinical implications, and lastly, conclusion, key takeaways, a discussion question, and then, of course, references. So, opening scenario. So say a 15-year-old is arrested and read their Miranda rights. Do we think that they truly understand what it means to stay silent? And when we think about that and our answer to that question, let's also think about who is competent to actually make this choice. This example highlights the real life stakes of competence. The law assumes everyone can exercise this right, but psychology shows us that that's not always the case. So our legal foundations, Miranda versus Arizona. So let's talk about the Miranda rights for a moment. So of course we've all heard, what it says. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have the right to talk to a lawyer. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be appointed to represent you. If you wish, if you decide to answer questions without a lawyer present, you have the right to stop answering at any time. And then, of course, the waiver at the end is, do you understand the rights that I just read to you? And having these rights in mind, do you wish to speak with us now? Um, so Miranda versus Arizona, that's the case that kind of set Miranda rights in stone. And basically it just established the requirement to inform suspects of their rights. Um, but to waive them, courts require the waiver to be knowing, intelligent, and voluntary. So what does that mean? In terms of knowing, that's really figuring out whether the suspect is aware of their Miranda rights, and were they clearly communicated by law enforcement. With intelligence, we're looking at if the suspect understood the rights they were abandoning and the consequences of their decision. This does not require the suspect to make a smart decision, only that they comprehend what was actually happening. Okay. And then with voluntary, basically, the waiver was the product of a free and deliberate choice, free from any sort of intimidation by police, coercion, or deception. And then it's just the baseline presumption of competence. The competence involves four elements, okay? Understanding the right, appreciating its personal relevance, reasoning through options, and then making a voluntary choice. So let's talk about the populations at risk. So Melton tells us that 23% of groups do not understand at least one of the Miranda rights, right? So let's just talk about a couple of them right now. So we have juveniles. Why are juveniles at risk? Of course, because of the limited maturity. Someone 10, 11, even 14, 15, 16 years old may not be at the proper level of maturity to understand any um any of the rights that are being discussed. Then we go to intellectual disabilities. That's when we're talking about people who have a surface level recall and limited application. And then we move to people with severe mental illness. Of course, they have some impaired reasoning that may may hinder them from understanding at least one, if not all. These groups are especially vulnerable to misunderstanding or misusing the right to remain silent. They may seem competent on the surface, but may lack deeper comprehension. So let's move to assessment practices and how we measure whether someone is competent enough to waive their Miranda rights or choose to remain silent. So some methods that we use to um assess whether someone is competent, we look at a clinical interview. Just someone, asking them questions, seeing like basing their competency level on like a conversation. And then we look at standardized tools. Okay. One of the most popular ones, the Grisso instruments, brought to you by Thomas Grisso. So the instruments for assessing understanding and appreciation of Miranda rights were originally developed in the 1970s by Thomas Grisso. They're used as a research tool to inform public policy about juveniles and adults' capacities to waive rights. The tool, composed of 4 distinct instruments, was subsequently adopted for use in juvenile and adult forensic evaluations, and the instruments were published for clinical use in 1998. Okay, so when we talk about, we said they're divided into 4 instruments. So the first one is the Comprehension of Miranda Rights, or CMR. So basically, it assesses and examines basic understanding of the 4 Miranda rights. So each warning is read aloud, and the examinee is asked to paraphrase each warning. Once the examinee responds, they're scored on a score from 0 to 2, from inadequate to adequate. And then they're also asked standardized questions to probe questionable and inadequate responses. The second tool is comprehension of Miranda rights recognition. So it also assesses and examines basic understanding of the 4 Miranda warnings, but does so without relying on verbal expressive skills. So the warnings are presented with 3 pre-constructed sentences, and the examinee must determine whether the meaning of each sentence is semantically identical to the associated warning. And then the third tool is the function of rights in interrogation. So that's more than basic understanding by targeting and examinee's appreciation for the significance of the Miranda rights. 4 separate illustrations of police, legal, and court proceedings are each accompanied by a short vignette. After reading each vignette, the examiner asks questions about the boy. And then there are 15 standardized questions that assess appreciation of the 3 areas. Fourth and final tool is the comprehension of Miranda vocabulary, which assesses understanding of 6 vocabulary words that are typically used in Miranda warnings. Those 6 words are consult, attorney, interrogation, appoint, entitled, and right. Originally, there were 9 words. However, the vast majority of participants in that pilot study adequately understood 3 of the words, and consequently, those 3 words were discarded. The examiner shows the vocabulary word to the examinee while reading out loud, using it in a sentence and repeating it. The examinee is then asked to define the word. The score range is from 0 to 12, okay? And it takes about 10 minutes. Then we look at contextual factors. Custodial pressure, that would be when either a parent or guardian is pressuring said juvenile to, or said whoever to waive or not waive. Police tactics, that's just the police kind of being intimidating or whatever it is to get the answers that they want for this case. And then the emotional state, of course, how is the emotional state of the subject in question when they are being asked. Then we look at the legal and clinical implications. Competence evaluations protect defendants and safeguard fairness in the criminal process. Courts rely on psychologists to explain whether a waiver was truly valid. So incompetence equals the confession is inadmissible. If someone doesn't understand the Miranda rights and they confess to a crime, they cannot be held. The admission will not be held up. Okay, basically. And then psychologists guide courts with expert evaluations and then protects fairness of the justice system. That is why we have these legal and clinical implications to protect fairness of the justice system. So our key takeaway here is going to be so competence is more than just repeating words, okay? Competence requires true understanding, appreciation, reasoning, and voluntariness. Um, Someone being competent enough to waive anything, but in this case, the right to remain silent, protects their rights and the integrity of the justice system. Competence to exercise the right to remain silent is a crucial safeguard. It ensures decisions are informed, voluntary, and fair. So, our discussion question: what role should mental health professionals play in ensuring that a suspect's decision to waive their rights is truly knowing, intelligent, and voluntary? Should their evaluations be binding on courts or only advisory? And I have a link to the psychological assessment in legal context. They have an article called "Are Courts Keeping Junk Science Out of the Courtroom?" I want you to give that article a little look over and then, think about that question, okay? And then here are my references. And yeah, thank you for watching.